Welcome to the part 3 of Spring Boot Tips series. Logging is a very important and common requirement for most of the applications. And Spring Boot is all about making it easy to implement those common requirements. So let us explore how to implement logging in Spring Boot applications. So in this episode, we are going to take a quick look at how we used to do logging before Spring Boot and how Spring Boot is making it easy to implement logging with its default logging support, and how we can tweak and customize those logging configurations, and how we can implement logging specific to a selected profile. Maybe we want to do logging in a different way in dev environment, we want to do differently in production environment. So how Spring supports that. And also finally we are going to take a quick look at what are some common best practices for logging. Let us take a quick look at what are the options available for logging in Java. So there is Java util logging within JDK itself, and there used to be commons logging which was heavily used, and then there is log4j, logback, and log4j2, jboss logging. So there are plenty of options. And then there is slf4j, which is not the actual logging implementer, but it's a facade to other logging providers. So basically if you rely upon slf4j API only, you will be able to switch any of the implementation. Maybe you want to use slf4j along with log4j2 or slf4j with logback. So the advantage is, even if you want to switch any of the logging library provider, your code won't change. That's a good improvement. And let us see how we usually do logging in our application, right? Let's say we are using log4j. So this is how we usually do. We create a log4j properties file and configure what is the appender and what is the pattern that we want to use and all that. And we get a reference to logger like this, logger.getLogger, and whatever the class you want to use. And there is other option like instead of using properties file, you may want to use XML configuration, log4j XML. So you can use append as same thing we can implement. But instead of log4j, if you want to log back, you need to create a different XML configuration file. Syntax could be slightly different. But the point I am trying to make is, depending on the library you are using and depending on the configuration format that you want to use, whether XML or properties, the logging configuration changes. So now coming to Spring Boot. So again, Spring Boot is all about making it easy to implement common application requirement, and logging is used in every application. If you are putting your application in production, you should take logging very seriously, because if anything goes wrong, that is where you will be looking at first what went wrong. And Spring Boot comes with logging support by default. You don't have to configure anything out of the box. When you create a Spring Boot application, it is already pre-configured with slf4j and logback. Okay, but if you want to switch logback to log4j2 for any reason, it's very easy to switch, and without doing any custom configuration. It is simply adding a log4j2 starter and excluding the default logging starter. That's all you need to do to switch to log4j2. And even the best part is, you don't have to create those configuration files like the log4j2 properties or log4j XML, logback.xml. You don't have to create those XMLs, and simply you can configure most of these logging configuration properties in application.properties file only. You don't have to create. But for any reason you need more control over the logging configuration, then definitely you can go ahead and create those logging configuration files like logback.xml or log4j2.xml, and Spring Boot will respect that. So it is very convenient and very easy to configure within the application.properties itself. Okay, let's create a simple Spring Boot application and see how we can implement logging. I have created a simple Spring Boot application, and we have a main entry point class over here and an empty application properties, nothing configured, and also I have one demo controller with a simple REST endpoint. Okay, let me run this application. And here I am getting a logger instance, and I am using SLF4j classes over here, and I am obtaining the logger for demo controller. And when I hit the endpoint hello, I am logging what is the name that I provided. Okay, now let us call this API endpoint. Yeah, we got the response. And now if we take a look at console, it is already printing name world. Okay, so it's working. I did not do anything. I simply get this logger and it is working. I have not configured anything. We don't have any log4j properties or logback XML files, nothing. And even if we take a look at pom.xml, so here we have starter web and we have DevTools, Lombok and test. Nothing is configured explicitly for logging, but still I am able to get all this logging. And even if you take a look at the logs, there is plenty of good information, usual timestamp and what is the log level, and this is PID, process ID, and this is what is the thread and what is the class and the actual message. So we got good logging message out of the box. We don't configure anything, but just let us understand how this all work fine. Okay, now when we add this starter web dependency, if you explore the dependencies of it, now I am expanding this starter web dependency, and I can see here it depends on Spring Boot starter. Okay, even if we expand that, there is Spring Boot starter logging. There is another starter that again depends on this Spring Boot starter logging, and even if we expand it more, we can see it has SLF4j and then logback classic dependencies added. So even though we are not explicitly adding these logging dependencies, when we add any Spring Boot starter which internally depends on Spring Boot starter and which transitively pulls Spring Boot starter logging, that's how we got all the dependencies. Fine, we got the dependencies, but where are we specifying what is the log format, what pieces we want to put in the logs, where are we specifying it, right? So let us take a peek at within the logging starter itself. Okay, so if I navigate to Spring Boot logging, okay, not Spring Boot. So here I am checking inside Spring Boot jar file. There we can find logging package, and here there is log4j to logback, and if we expand logback, there are defaults.xml. So here if you see, there are some common patterns that are defined. Console log pattern, so what needs to print, what is the default timestamp pattern here, and what is the log level, and this is to print process ID, and here we have message and package name. So all what is the pattern that we want to follow, and for file logging pattern, so some constants are defined in defaults.xml file, and there is console appender where it defines the console appender. It specifies what is the pattern to use and what is the char set, and this is the console appender class we are going to use. And again, there is another file appender XML configuration file. This is a rolling file appender and specifies what is the pattern and char set and what is the log file name to use for logging, and rolling policy defined, like what is the file pattern for this, and what is the rolling policy, like what is the max size and all that. Okay, so if you take another look at this base XML, we are including those defaults which define all those patterns and everything, and then it includes log file, what is the default logging location, log file location, and it also includes console appender, file appender. So Spring Boot by default defines these common patterns for console appender and file appender, and internally if you don't specify anything, it is going to use these configuration files and then log accordingly. That's why without we having to do anything, we are able to get this logging out of the box using these defaults. If we want to change anything for any reason, then we can start and tweak those configurations using, let's say I want to change log level, default log level. By default it is let's say logging level dot root. By default it is info, I think. Let us change it to debug. Okay, now right now we are getting info and warn messages only, right? Now I am changing the root log level to debug, and if I restart, you can see we'll get a lot more debug messages because we enabled debug level. So it will print a lot of debug messages as well, right? So the point is, we don't have to create any of those logging library specific XMLs or properties files. You can tweak the logging configuration within the application.properties itself. For example, if I print right now in my controller, I'm using logger info, right? So what if I use trace, and let me change it back to info, which is a default. It won't print, isn't it? Because we have used trace, but trace level is not enabled. The default is info only. Now even if I make this API call, I won't see that message here. So how I can change it? Okay, currently my controller is in com.SivaLabs package. I can go and change the logging level dot com dot SivaLabs equals to trace. I want to enable trace for my com.SivaLabs package. I'm restarting it. So now if I make a API call, I will see this logging statement here. So that's how easy it is to simply change it. And also for any reason, if we by default console appender is enabled and logging file appender is not enabled. Let's say we want to enable file appender. How we can do that? Logging dot file name. Let's say I want it to be my app.log. Okay. And by mentioning this logging file name, it enables both console appender as well as file appender, both. We can see here all the logs, and if I refresh, I can see my app.log also. If I make API call, I am able to see both in this logging file and console also. So it is that easy. Just add a property, you got console appender and file appender working fine. Now if we go back, and typically this is how you can customize various things, like suppose you want to set logging level to 1 for ORG Spring Framework, and for Hibernate you want to enable debug level. This is how you can do it. And another interesting feature that is added is, let's say you have several packages in your application, and for a bunch of packages you want to enable certain log level, let's say debug level. So instead of specifying all those different packages and then specifying the log level, you can group them. Let's say, for example, for whatever reason in my application I have com.SivaLabs and org.SivaLabs packages, and I can logically group them under SivaLabs group. Okay, logging.group.SivaLabs, and specify all those packages. And using that group name, I can enable a specific log level. I don't have to specify logging.level.com.sivalabs equals to debug, logging.level.org.sivalabs equals to debug, like that. I can group them logically, and then I can enable one specific level for the entire group. That's a very good convenience within your application. Probably you want to enable some level at the controller level, and for all the business logic you want to enable differently, different log level. That's easy to achieve in this log groups pattern. Okay, and also you can tweak what is the pattern that you want to use. For any reason, if the default logging pattern is not suitable for you, you can change it. And also simply enabling this logging file name, you will be able to specify and enable this file appender. An interesting feature provided by most of the logging libraries is MDC, Mapped Diagnostic Context. So let's say we are building an API and only authenticated users call this API, and you want to print who is the user calling certain APIs, and every log statement you want to include who is the user calling this one. Okay, so to implement that, the easiest way would be to have a filter and extract the user information from request and put it in the MDC, and you can configure your logging pattern to include those MDC context variables. Okay, let us take a look at it and how we can implement this. So right now we did not overwrite any pattern here, which means by default we are using what comes out of the box. Let's take this console log pattern here. So I am overriding the default logging pattern for console. I'm going to remove most of the things just to be to make it simpler. Okay, now if I restart, okay, everything looks fine, and if I make a call, I'm still seeing this logging fine. Okay, now what we can do here, just for getting to know the concept of MDC, let's say whenever somebody makes this API call, we want to put slfrc mdc dot put user ID, let's say 1234. Okay, so I am putting user ID in MDC, and I am restarting this. So behind the scenes, MDCs use thread local so that it won't mess with other requests. this data will be pertained only for that particular request. So now if we make a API call, we got it, but how do we make this user ID appear in log files, right? So let's say after PID I want to print user ID colon. So this is the format to print any MDC variable, %x, and within braces you need to put your variable name that you have used in your MDC key. Okay, so we just specified user ID and %x and variable user ID. Okay, now if I restart and I'm making a API call, here you can see by default when it print nothing, and when I make API call, because by that time we have this user ID variable in MDC context, we are able to see this value here. But this is not how we intend to use it, right? We want to automatically do it for all the log statements. So let's create a filter. So I'll call it as MDC filter, and Spring Boot provides this convenience class of once per request filter, and I'll mark this as a Spring component, and Spring Boot will take care of automatically registering this filter, and all I need to do is implement do filter internal. Here I'm going to do filter chain dot do filter request and response. I'll simply delegate this, and finally, so here before proceeding to, I'll put mdc dot put user ID. So ideally here we should be getting the token, I mean who is the user from request or something. Probably this is what maybe you want to use, request dot getter get header and say user ID, and you might want to get user ID from header and then use it, but for sake of discussion let us put some random UID. Okay, and I'm going to put that in MDC, and finally once the request processing is done we should be clearing this up. I'm going to remove user ID, or you can even use to clear completely, clear all the variables, not just user ID. Okay, so here to recap what we are doing, we have created a filter extending once per request filter from Spring framework, and we are marking it as a Spring component so that it will automatically register as a filter, and we are delegating the actual call to respective controllers, but before that we are extracting the user ID and then putting it into MDC under this user ID variable, and then once the request is done we are clearing the MDC context. Okay, now we don't need to specify it over here. Okay, and in our application properties we have user ID colon %x and user ID. We are printing user ID from the MDC. Okay, let us restart and verify whether we are getting this value or not. So here if you take a look at it, we can see this user ID value automatically printed. Okay, cool. But here in the above logs, if you take a look at it, it is empty, maybe fine, but if you want to put some default value when the actual value is not present, so this is a notation to have default value colon dash and maybe here you can put anonymous or guest or something like that. I'll put guest. So if I restart, yeah, by default there is no value, so that's why we can have guest printed over here. But when I make this API call, it's going to print MDC value. Okay, nice. One another cool feature, like if you notice, there are these log levels printed in different colors, and the class names printed in different colors. So you want to color your variables here. Here we can simply follow what it is doing. Let's take this percentage CLR, and I want to print it with magenta only. Okay. Okay. Now you notice, right? Our user ID is also getting printed in the color. Cool. What if I not only have user ID? Let's say I also have some correlation ID, so that I can see all the logs that belongs to a particular request. Let's say I have some correlation ID, and you can generate again using random UUID. Okay, so how do we print it? Again, same, we can go back to our configuration file, and then we would be able to add another similar to this. We could add another one specifying that correlation ID. Okay, let me take this key here and put it over here, so I can just print space. Okay, this works. Now just to verify, so okay, it has this correlation ID. Yeah, it is printing correlation ID. But let's say you want to print all the variables that are there in the MDC. So the easiest way is, instead of specifying one variable, you can simply print %x without specifying any particular variable. In this way, it is going to print all the variables that are there in the MDC. Let me restart. So it is no more correlation ID, it is like context. Let us name it as context. Okay, and so now if I make an API call, you can see first of all we still have this user ID printed over here, but under context it has both user ID and correlation ID as well. So if you want to print everything, you don't have to specify after %x what is the variable you want to print. If you simply leave it to %x, it's going to print all the variables like the way here. We had good fun with tweaking these patterns and all using MDC, but let's say there is a limitation of how much you can configure here. Let's say you want to add a new appender like SMTP appender or JSON based appender, things like that, which you cannot configure solely through this properties file. So in that case, you can actually create logback.xml file and put the configuration over there. Instead of configuring through properties in application.properties, you can actually create logback.xml, and yeah, here we can reuse that are already defined within the Spring framework itself. We have this defaults XML, and we have file appender. So under defaults, right, we have all the variables defined, and we have console appender and file appender. So we can reuse them. We can specify, okay, I want to have I can import both console and file appenders from the existing resources, and I can specify, okay, root level I want to have info, and I want to redirect all the logs to console appender, and I can specify these log levels. So this is how you usually do even without Spring Boot. And when you have this file, Spring Boot will respect this. Okay, now I removed all the properties, logging related properties from my application properties file. I have this logback.xml, and if I restart it right now, so still it's going to work as same. So this default format of logback.xml configuration works fine. But what if you want to use a different appender? If you are running with a local profile, and if you are running with any non-local profile, let's say you are running with dev profile, QA profile, or staging prod, anything, and you might want to use file appender instead of console appender. How do you do that conditionally? By default, if you use logback.xml alone, you cannot do that. But there is a Spring Boot extension for logback which allows us to do that. Instead of using logback.xml, we should name it as logback-spring.xml. Let us check in the official documentation how we can use profile specific configuration. If you go to Spring Boot docs, under core features there is logging, under which there is logback extensions section. So here you can see we can use this Spring profile name property to customize what configuration you want to enable if we are running with staging profile. And here we have, it's not a simple one profile. We can also check whether it is dev profile or staging, still do this. And if it is not production, that means any profile apart from production, enable this. So let us take this, and here I can put, if it is local profile, I want to use only console. But if it is any other profile that is non-local, I want to use, let's say, file appender. Okay, I can remove it here, right? So here we have one Spring profile definition which is local, and in that case, if the application is running with local profile, we are printing it to the console only. If it is any other profile apart from local, maybe it is dev, QA, or prod, anything, so we are using file appender. So this is how we can customize the logging configuration based on the profile. And also there is one more important feature. In addition to Spring profile, we can also actually use Spring properties that we define in our properties file or through environment variables. So we can take this Spring property definition and include at the top and change it to region, and I want to read it from app.region property, and I would like to use US East 1 as the default region value. And now because if you look at file appender, the actual file name would be using this log file variable name. So let us define that variable here. Property name equals to log file and value equals to. So how I want to name my log file? I want to use region hyphen myapp.log. So what I am doing here, I am using this string property to read the variable, to read the property app.region value and put it in name region, and with a default value of US East 1. And I am creating a log file property with region prefix and myapp.log. Okay. Now, if I don't configure app.region value anything here, it would use US East 1, but as I have app.region, it should take US East 2 and generate the log file as US East 2 hyphen myapp.log file. Okay. Now let us start the application and see. Okay, let me refresh. So here you can see US East 2 myapp. Okay. So that way you can use properties dynamically from app region. And yeah, the good thing is these variables are not required to statically defined here. For example, you are running your application in AWS, and this region could be dynamic depending on in which region you are running your application. But as long as you are able to replace this with system properties or environment variables, that is good. Let us say, let us tweak our application configuration and modify options and environment variables. We can say app underscore region equals to AP Southeast 2. Just I am trying to change app.region value dynamically using environment variable. Now if I restart the application, so it created AP Southeast 2 myapp.log file. So that's how you can use any dynamic properties from application properties. Okay. We have looked at various configuration options and how to tweak them. Let's also just quickly take a look at how we can change default logging, which is using logback, to log4j2. So it's really as simple as excluding default logging SpringBoot starter logging. Yeah, excluded that, but you need to then include what is the starter you want to use for logging. SpringBoot starter not logging, it would be log4j2. Okay, so this is all you need to do to switch to log4j2. Okay, and again in the same way, instead of using logback-spring.xml to tweak further the default configuration, you need to create log4j2-spring.xml if you want to customize. That's all you have to do. Okay, I think we have covered good enough ground about how to do logging in Spring Boot applications. Now let us take a glance at what are some common best practices while doing logging. So one of the common requirement is to be able to identify all the logs related to a particular request. Let's say when a user makes a API call or something, we may end up writing a bunch of log statements, and when something goes wrong, we want to identify all the log statements that belongs to a particular request. In that case, this correlation ID or tracking ID, whatever you call, with MDC, that helps a lot. And next thing is to make sure not to log any sensitive data. Sometimes we just print an entire object, and maybe by mistake there is a toString method which is printing all the variables, and that object might contain a sensitive data like passwords or keys, something like that. So you need to be very careful about logging this sensitive data. You need to double check before printing an entire object or whatever comes out of the box from request parameters, things like that. Okay. And another one is, if you notice in some code bases there is debug enabled, is trace enabled, the checks are there. And again, this is one of the popular interview question as well. By default, if you make this log level, let's say info, automatically it won't print these debug statements or trace statements, right? Then why do we need to check is debug enabled, is trace enabled? If they are not enabled, anyway those log statements won't be printed. So the reason being, usually we use debug or trace in log statements to print more detailed information. That may involve even calling some other methods also. So if we don't check that, let's go to our controller. Let's say here I am doing logger.trace some message, and then maybe I am calling some a method to print some verbose info. Okay, so here whether trace is enabled or not, this method will still be executed. So it's a waste of execution time, right? It's unnecessarily you are allocating more memory and performing some operations by calling this method, and finally it is going to check whether trace is enabled. If not, it's not going to be useful. So that is why you will typically check for logger.is debug enabled and then print. So with this one, here itself the check happens, and then there is no need to execute this method. And then again, are you going to put for every info or warn or all kinds of statements? No, usually we use trace and debug to print verbose information. Checking only for those makes sense. You don't have to check for every log level. Okay, cool. And in the recent times, like we are moving towards microservices, and we want to use some centralized logging stack like ELK, Elastic, Logstash, and Kibana, or Elastic, Elasticsearch, and Fluentd and Kibana. So in that kind of a setup, you might want to use structured logging, maybe in JSON format instead of this plain text-based logging. You might want to use a structured logging. And also, if you are doing this distributed systems, and this associating correlation ID and tracking ID with MDC is okay for a single service, but you are running a group of microservices, and you might want to track entire call chain from one microservice to another microservice, then you might need this distributed tracing feature. And there is a project called Spring Cloud Sleuth which provides that facility. So this is one another important topic when you deal with microservices. Okay, so yeah, these are the few things that you need to keep in mind while implementing logging. And if you find any other practices also, please comment below, okay, so that others also get benefit out of it. Okay, that's all about logging, and I hope this video is really helpful, and thanks for watching.